So we're speaking obviously in some really interesting times, right? Which is you're now in the second, well, we're in the second wave of of COVID in Tokyo, things like that, and people are now back in remote working. And how's the whole remote work COVID experience been for you?
It's funny. I'm working for an American company in Japan now, and it's a technology company. And I feel the easy answer to that question
Mm-hmm.
is it's been remarkably seamless and easy.
Mm-hmm.
The company is sort of designed
Mm-hmm.
to do this kind of remote work, and
Mm-hmm.
so it's been seamless. But I'm a strange situation because I live walking distance from my office, from the company's office. So I still come to the office almost every day because I'm living, this is delving into personal, but I'm living with my girlfriend and her two teenage kids now. And so it's impossible to work at home. So I
Oh.
could
Mm-hmm.
come to the office every day throughout the pandemic, and it was safe because nobody was
Mm-hmm.
here, and
Oh.
still get my work done.
Wow, that's actually almost a luxurious situation, isn't it? That you have this entire office building all for yourself.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes I feel like I'm in one of those like Twilight Zone episodes where you're or a sci-fi space traveler where I wake up from hypersleep and I'm walking around an empty office with blinking screens and
Yeah, you're like,
you
did I miss
know
something? Did the
yeah,
spaceship leave already?
I'm talking to computers or AI, and I'm sort of the last man on earth. It feels like, and that's a little strange. But once I get out of that, I'm pretty productive. So COVID has been, for me personally, because I probably in a special case living walking distance from my office has been pretty seamless for me. Yeah.
How exciting. That's so, that's also so rare. So I'm glad that you've at least got a positive light out of this, somewhat difficult situation. So I'm glad to hear that. Now, what we kind of want to jump into today is when people say that you work in Japan, there's always question marks. Why? Why Japan? And what's it like? And it must be so mysterious and all these kind of questions.
Hmm.
What we kind of want to do today was talk about your book, which is the Salaryman, and to talk about your very unique experience of working at very kind of traditional Japanese companies and those kinds of experiences. Of course, we wanted to dive into that, and we wanted to hear the stories. But more than that, we wanted to hear kind of the deeper beyond that. What was the learnings and what can people take away? Because many of the listeners of the Business Karaoke podcast live in Japan as well, so they know the pressure of the nomikais and the meetings and
Mm.
all this kind of stuff. So what we kind of wanted to do was look past that and then dive into kind of those lessons. So before we do that, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Salaryman book and the motivation to write it, and maybe just a few of the outstanding stories, because there's so many.
Thank you for the compliment on the book. The book was, I half jokingly call it, it was sort of self-therapy. It was my way of dealing with really the assimilation process
Mm-hmm.
of fitting into these very traditional companies. And as a background, I did not have the language training or the cultural training in Japanese coming into these roles. And the companies themselves were extremely traditional. So it's not a typical case.
Mm-hmm.
If you come to Japan, work for a Japanese company like I did, you're probably not going to have the same traditional level of extreme Japanese manners or formality. So I was in a fish out of water to the extreme
Mm-hmm.
situation, which is a lot of pain, but it also has a lot of pleasure in it, and for like the learnings that you make, and the humor that came out of it too. So the book was a way for me to like express that, and I started it as a blog before it became a book years later. So the book, the genesis of it was like 5-6 years, and I changed companies a couple times.
Mm-hmm.
It was 5-6 years of sort of the gestation there with the manga artist I partnered with to illustrate the book. We started out slowly on a blog, and that blog was called Manner Mode, which was
Mm-hmm.
my name for my assimilation process. I called it Manner Mode. How do I get into my Japanese manner mode out of my American casual, mode. That was my way of calling it and giving it a name. And so I just came up with the book was my way of coming up with theories on why some parts of the culture gap are solvable and some aren't,
Mm-hmm.
between the US anyway and Japan, and my personal, what I brought to the table or didn't bring to the table as
Mm-hmm.
far as language or cultural expectations. So I've always had lots of Japanese friends and enthusiastic about Japanese culture, but not an expert in any aspect of it,
Mm-hmm.
language-wise or culturally. So I had enthusiasm, and that's about it coming into Japan. So this really was a blank slate. I came over as a middle-aged sort of white-collar worker with very little Japanese training. So for the listeners, that's sort of where the book comes from. It's not, here's a Japanese expert telling you what Japan's all about. It's more like, here's one guy's who was not really prepared, and it's sort of a typical slice of middle class US, one slice of it thrown into Japanese culture. Here's what his experience was like, and we can talk about the individual stories that I got out of it. But I learned really that it was about like, find any way you can when you're immigrating to another country or assimilating to keep your own personal identity intact, as you're doing all the adjustments. And if you don't, then that starts to come out in a negative way, I think. And so I learned, try to channel it into something productive for myself, keep my identity as in my case, as a writer, keep that dream alive, keep it going. And even though I wasn't really doing what I wanted to do in my jobs, make sure I had that expression of my identity still going in a positive way. So that's really what I learned out of the process of writing the book.
Mm-hmm. That's so important, really. When we're talking about identity, and this is often what people find, especially when they come somewhere like Japan, which in the first, kind of like 2 weeks, even 2 months, everyone's very polite and you think, oh, isn't this so wonderful? But then there's a period, where you kind of cross the chasm and you start recognizing that actually it's not simply politeness. I'm getting, blatantly, ignored in meetings, or, my ideas aren't being listened to and things like that. So I think kind of the Western mode is, you want to find that kind of fulfillment through your profession, or you want to find that fulfillment through your company. Whereas I found when you've come into a company as a foreigner, that's often not the case, that you have to really, have this kind of multi-layered approach to personal happiness, really. Because, we're only a couple minutes into the podcast. We're already talking about happiness, but this is really kind of, where it comes into. We're thinking, okay, how can I be happy? And if I don't have these challenging projects at work because, my boss or the company or whatever it is, it's not the time or it's not the circumstance, then I have to create it myself, which is exactly what you did. I think that's so essential to building that foundation. Is there anything else that you did to, not only in your personal life, as in, beginning with the blog, which is very intelligently and very funnily named manner mode, because in Japanese, for people that don't know, silent mode on your phone is also manner mode. So it's kind of this play on words to be silent, kind of shut up.
Right.
But was there a time where you started to find that individual, how can I bring my value to the table in your job? Or was that kind of where you really started to feel those challenges or those gaps?
Yeah, it was hard to bridge the individual versus group mentality. That was my first of my 5 years was, okay, suddenly things that you do individually as a habit, maybe coming from the US or Western culture, like taking your health exam or cleaning the office. Those are two things that are done as a group in a lot of cases, which shocks some Westerners. Like, what do you mean health exam as a group? Well, the actual hospitals come into the office and clear out the meeting rooms and put their blood pressure checking and
Yeah.
doctors and nurses all over the meeting room, and you're sit there with your colleagues in short gowns in the bright light and
Oh my
take your health exam
gosh. How's
as
your
a group.
blood? How's your blood pressure, Tanaka-san? Good, thanks, Mike. What about you?
Yeah, exactly. Chit chat. Yeah, health exam as a group activity was a new thing for me,
Yeah.
and so the those are laughing, like you're laughing at it, but it's sort of like, okay, you pile those up more and more, and you're sort of like, you lose a little bit of your comfort level. You're
Mhm.
always on a acting in some sort of, for me it was called manner mode. I just said, oh, it's all part of the experience
Mhm.
of me trying to get along and fit in. But at some point you don't want to do that too much, or it's just impossibly uncomfortable. That one I always went with somehow. But I always got out of cleaning the office as a group. I'm still ashamed of this, but I would sometimes conveniently disappear whenever it was cleaning time in the office, and we're all supposed to wipe the office clean. Um,
I think I would have probably escaped at the health exam one. I think I would have stayed for the cleaning and I would have run for the health exam, to be honest.
yeah, my choices were for me, but yeah, I think uh, to answer the question though, on like how do you bridge that? Um, so you look at it and go, okay, I'm expected to be part of the, think of the group first.
Mhm.
I got to think of the group first, but you need to have a 5-year plan for yourself too. That's sort of the one of the ideas, is like most professionals go into their careers, if they're reading up on how to prepare for, okay, what do I want to be 3, 5, 10 years down the line? And I think in Japan, it's traditional companies. Um, that's not usually part of their training or their upbringing, unless they've had, somewhat unusual upbringing. So having that private 5-year plan is a good idea. But you, like, for me, being married to a Japanese at that time, I needed to include my spouse in that plan too, and that was not always an easy communication either, on where we wanted to be, and expectations to be a salaryman or a seishain permanent employee. So I tried the path very hard to be the Japanese middle manager
Mhm.
as a goal. And one of the things that just roadblocked me from the beginning, that was hard to get around, that I think is worth some thought for people out there, is I was trying to see, how do I become a middle manager in a traditional Japanese company, and the requirement was to pass their management test in Japanese.
Mm.
I couldn't become a middle manager unless I passed a written exam that was a lot of things about, like, internal policies of the company, procedures, rules, and it was like this 3-month training program they took to pass a manager exam, all in very detailed Japanese, and I didn't have the Japanese language training. So I was sort of pitted from the beginning, where I couldn't escape that
Mhm.
limitation. I was never going to pass that exam. So these are the realities that I think if you're not prepared going into a job, you don't know the company well, or the industry like I
Mhm.
didn't. Those are some of the things I'd like to, like, think I could avoid in the future, or if I did it again, I'd certainly avoid that. That causes some difficult life obstacles, where you have to change companies mid-career, or change careers at later stages than you would want to. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's sort of a minefield, I think, when you
Mhm.
get yourself into scenarios you're not aware of that going into it.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
use the humor to get out of it.
Yeah, that's certainly one way. I think there's a really interesting dynamic when you're a foreigner abroad, and this is where's this lens that we have with the Business Karaoke podcast is certainly for Japan, but I could imagine this could be relevant for anyone anywhere. Is that you really have to be super careful and purposeful with your time, right? So you have to say, okay, what battles am I going to fight, right? Because you have to pick your battles when you're a foreigner. You cannot go up against everything that there's a gap or that you disagree with, because you'll just be, you won't have any time to get anything done. So when you said, for example, okay, this middle management test, that's not for me. It's kind of less that you have not, it's not that you don't have the ability, but it's more like in order the level of investment that it's going to require for me in order to pass this is not, in relation to, the output that I'll be getting, right? And so what was kind of your thinking process? Did you have anyone to talk to? But when do you make those decisions? When you say, okay, I've been in Japan X amount of years, or I've been in this company X amount of years, and I've tried my best for this company, but I've kind of seen what, in kind of quotation marks, like a glass ceiling. When do you say so when do you say, okay, this is for me,
Yeah.
the end of the road, I'm going to look for something new?
Yeah. I started with the guy who hired me, my hiring manager,
Mm-hmm.
who was my supervisor, and uh, he had very limited ability actually to make a special adjustment for me with the
Mm-hmm.
HR department.
Mm-hmm.
And so I could get on a long rant with about HR departments and my battles with them over the years, because I've always had a personal pet peeve with HR departments in my both in the U.S. and Japan as being anti-productive, let's say, in a lot of cases,
Mm-hmm.
to getting things done. So I went down as far as I could a path of saying, how can I don't want to make, you don't have to make a special test just for me. I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't expect that, but what else can we do? And they didn't come up with anything um, suitable to shoot for. I even proposed certain things to them I thought were reasonable, such as like, okay, if I did study Japanese for a year, would you help me out with that on the side? I know some of your younger employees are taking advantage of English teachers coming to the office. Um, I'll pay for half of it. Would you help support the other half? And I wasn't able to even get those sort of
Mm-hmm.
minimal resources. And so I just thought, well, okay, they're forcing my hand a little bit there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I tried one of this company I was at, technically was actually an American company. It was a wholly owned subsidiary in Japan that I was working for, that was operated as a Japanese company for all intents and purposes. So the other avenue I went down was, okay, well, I wonder if I should think about transferring back to the US with this company.
Mm-hmm.
And then my wife at the time didn't want to do that. So I
Sure.
couldn't get out of that either, go
Mm-hmm.
down that path. So what ended up for me being the right move after exhausting a couple of different options was finding another company. And that's a whole nother story, is that it wasn't exactly a good choice either. after that, my salary went up 20 or 25%, but that was about the best part of what that second move ended up being.
Mm-hmm.
So I found myself the victim of my own sort of, I think, probably a little bit short-term thinking
Mm-hmm.
uh, to start with in Japan.
Yeah.
You need to think longer term, and probably starting with language and how long you really want to stay in the country um, is a good place to start to avoid that.
Yeah. And I think that certainly is the beginning of a conversation, being the long-term thinking, because it is something that you do need to, adjust to, especially if you're abroad, right? And so you're a foreigner, you're somewhere new, and you're kind of always thinking, maybe I'll, go home. There's always this kind of, kind of play in your mind. But really, we have to approach, even if you're working abroad, you really have to approach, your career with, as you mentioned, a very purposeful, like 5-year plan. Where do I want to be? And without, every day of those 5 years asking yourself, am I happy? Am I not happy? Is this going well? Is this not going well? For me, I've found, rather than that kind of continuous questioning, which can kind of drive one crazy, is to zoom out a little bit and take it in kind of seasons. Maybe a season for you is a job, maybe a season is an actual season, like summer, autumn, winter, spring, like whatever that is for you. So I've certainly found that long term being really helpful. And we've kind of laughed about, that the best learning comes from the real kind of pain, you know, and the lessons and things like that. But what else would you say that, you know, looking back kind of now with a good portion of learning and experience, would you say that, okay, long-term thinking is certainly something that is maybe more, should be more at the forefront if you're planning or you're having a career in Japan? What are some other things that you would recommend for foreigners or, you know, people working abroad in Japan that you learned, that you said, ah,
Mhm.
missed that one, I'll remember that for
Yeah.
next time?
Well, actually, my mistakes would be take us down a long rabbit hole. But the thing I actually would recommend that worked for me really well
Mm.
is I always have had success with when I decided to be honest during the negotiation stage and not ask for things that cost money, but actually more about like family-based things or like things based on a sense of just like common sense. For example,
Mhm.
I would say, you know, I've always told my bosses before I join a company, I can imagine a year from now I'm going to want to go back and visit my parents in Chicago. For
Mhm.
you guys during Obon, it's just the Shinkansen 2 hours, maybe round trip max for
Mhm.
you guys to go visit your parents. For me, it's got to be 10 days or it's not even worth going.
Yeah.
I need your flexibility that there'll be no problem with me doing that. Because the last thing you want is your fundamental like family values to be challenged by your choice of your career here in Japan. So I've always had success getting those out in the open. Like
Yeah.
this is something that you guys need to be aware of. Um, I've been sent on Tanshin Funin assignments,
Ah, yeah, that.
sent away from my family. Those are the assignments where employees are sent without them choosing to do so away from their family to some remote
Yeah.
um, company location.
Can we also just make a parenthesis here that there's a verb for that? You know, or that there's a noun for that, that, you know, this is so common that there's a word. Like, in order for us to explain that to, you know, like a
Yeah,
non-Japanese audience, we need to say, well, what it is, it's an assignment where I have to go as an individual away from my family while they stay, you
yeah,
know, in our home. It's a long sentence, whereas the Japanese have, boom, a word for it because it happens so much.
yeah. It's a word that implies a whole lifestyle, and
Ah, horrible.
uh, I didn't. Yeah, I didn't know it was possibly going to happen to me. In my first time, it
Yeah.
happened to me, and I think I should have known about it beforehand, and I would have let them know that if that happens, you send me back to San Jose, which was in my case, California. Well, if that's you're going to do that, and my family isn't supported, then I want to be able to work as much as possible from Chicago because you have an office there too, and I have family there. So
So they sent
I
you to
did
the
all of that.
States, not even to just like a random Japanese city where you could like go home for the weekends. They sent you to the States.
Yeah, they sent
Oh.
me to the States, which was weird. It was like reverse culture shock for
Welcome,
me.
my son from Japan. Let us teach you about America.
I know. It's always been my dream to be an expat in the U.S. as an American,
Tick,
because
achieved.
health healthcare's free. Oh, okay, that takes away one of the down points of the U.S. and free car, free housing in San Jose. Boy, that that's nice. The U.S. suddenly becomes a glorious, glorious place once you take care of those things. Uh, but yeah, I so it didn't occur to me that this all would happen to me. So I ended up like sort of doing things to keep myself sane, like say, yes, I will work in San Jose for 3-4 months. It was
Mhm.
only that long without my family, but I am
It's
going to
long
go back to
enough.
Chicago on my own dime, but
Mm.
because I can't just sit there in an empty San Jose apartment and live like a bachelor anymore. Like that's just not what you can't expect me to do that. So they were like, oh, that's I've never been asked that before. So those
Mhm.
wrinkles, it's hard for foreigners to imagine them happening sometimes, but they come at you. Um, and so try to talk to people and listen to shows like this and hear foreigners talk about the wrinkles that can come, the seen around the corners.
Mhm.
Help take away some of the anxiety.
Mhm. It's weird, isn't it? It's a weird situation because as much as there's this, you know, like Japanese job security and like the whole you're one of us and family and, you know, even the way that Japanese people introduce themselves, they say that they are the company's blah blah. So for example, if I'm
Mhm.
Tanaka-san and I work at Toyota, I will say Toyota no Tanaka desu, you know, and so it's kind of this possession particle that I belong to my company. But when you're a foreigner, you don't fit the systems, right? Your name is too long for the ID card, you know, the katakana, the HR gets super mad at you for changing your business cards, like all this stuff, you know, that happens.
Yeah.
And so there's this expectation of the same level of loyalty as a Japanese employee, but at the same time, you're like, hang on a second, but I'm not getting that kind of, you know, golden employee package. So it is a difficult environment to navigate, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I absolutely the things I negotiated, like the last Japanese company I worked for, I was sent Tanshin Funin assignment
Mm-hmm.
to Osaka. And I actually got to manage a team for the first time in my life. And it was an all Japanese engineering team. So it was a good opportunity. And they were great guys and we got along great. But
Mm-hmm.
I negotiated, I had young kids in Tokyo,
Mm-hmm.
family there. I said, I'll have an apartment in Osaka. I can do that. But
Yeah.
I need to be able to, my boss was in Tokyo. And I said, can you just give me your word that I can come back every weekend? Um, and he gave me his word. And I didn't push to have it in writing, which
Interesting.
can be a difficult
Yeah.
thing
Yeah.
from a Westerner point of view,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Yeah, I'm sure you've come across that a lot. And I was aware of that, not to push for too many things in writing. Trust the word of your boss, and that got me a long way. He absolutely backed up his word,
Mm-hmm.
and I got to go back to Tokyo as much as I wanted. That caused a little resentment on my team, though, because half of
Shogunai.
them
Yeah.
were Tanshin Funin with families back in Tokyo, uh, and a couple of them had young kids too, and so they weren't given that same benefit, but they didn't push for it either, and they
Mm.
wouldn't.
And
So
they have the other benefits. So it's kind of, it all comes out in the wash.
yeah, it all. I was like, hey, like you guys are Seishine. I actually am
Hmm.
Keiokushine.
Yeah.
So
Which
I'm
is a
like,
contract employee, which for people that are listening, which is a contract employee
mhm.
and often suggests less job security.
Yeah, but I countered that, and they were very fair to me. I said,
Mm.
but you need to put a provision in the contract that you can't just like let me go for no reason.
Mm. Mm.
And so they did do that. They were very reasonable. So there are things you can do. Um, I did find hiring managers, the actual people who hired me, willing to reason and work those things out. Um, HR departments were always the difficulty of it, and so uh, that I could rail on forever. But that I found, try to develop a relationship with an understanding of honesty with your hiring manager during that before you sign anything, because
Mm-hmm.
they commit to you, and once they commit to you, it's a big loss of face for them for you to back out.
Mm.
A job offer. So you do have leverage. You won't probably get the money that you're asking for, but you can ask for other things that are more, uh, tangible, personal things,
Mm-hmm.
like I did, and it usually works out.
You've said two things that have really stood out to me. The first thing actually was even recommended by one of the and a previous podcast guest. Her name's Catherine. She specializes in high executive transitions to Japan, right? She said, when
Mhm.
you're communicating with your team, use examples. And that's exactly what you did. So when you said to your boss, rather than saying, I need time to go back home, for example, like, yes or like, will I get vacation time? Yes or no? What you did was you drew an example. And this, for example, and this is a really impactful way, because then it becomes real. Okay, you're right. When it's Obon is usually 5 days. And actually we're speaking right now in Obon.
Yeah.
Are you going back to, your hometown or whatever? And using a very specific example is really helpful in not only helping you communicate what your needs are, but also helping them understand what it is that you mean by vacation time. Because to a Japanese person, 5 days off, that's vacation. That's a whole lot, right?
Mm,
And then
yeah.
the second thing is don't push too much on the maybe the form of the yes, so to say. So as you said, I've got this opportunity, or with the I need your word that I can go back to Tokyo. The reason that we don't want this in writing, and people from cultures like Germany, for example, lose their mind when things aren't in writing. But the reason why this is really difficult is because anything new is often no, right? And the no is not necessarily no, we don't want to, no, we don't want to support you. It's the no, I wouldn't even know what step one is to even give you what you want. So I'm just going to have to say no. So
Yeah.
using that kind of leverage to step back a little bit and kind of you're offering something that's important to you, but not asking for it to be delivered in the form that you need it as well. You're like, okay, this is what I need, but give it to me in the way that's comfortable or that's appropriate for you. I think that's genius.
Yeah, I wish I could say I thought of it without having made the mistake before, but I did. Like, so I learned from my first, right, 4 times. It's like, how many life lessons do I have to absorb here? But I learned through failure to really get through the Tanshin Funin transfer thing
Yeah.
without feeling bitter about it. So I learned from that first lesson, and I said, okay, you send me to Osaka, just need to know I can go back to Tokyo.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as work is done on Friday night, that would be my expectation. Might not always happen, but I want that peace of mind, and that was it. It
Mm-hmm.
was fine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
genius. I think that's such a takeaway. You can certainly have your personal view, your personal needs, but be flexible in how you allow your Japanese client or organization to deliver that to you. I think that's a really good balance to take away. And obviously, in order to do that, you need to have a certain level of, relationships and understanding of the stakeholders and stuff like this. And this is a never-ending conversation in Japan. What was your experience in navigating these, complex networks of stakeholders and bosses and, bosses abroad and things like that?
Yeah. I do. I know all the terms and the processes, the nemawashi, behind the scenes negotiating stuff, that the meeting, the decision's already made before the meeting even happens, kind of thing. I uh, I had a lot of good mentors
Mm-hmm.
at usually at these companies, and that really helped me not really waste my time trying to learn. Well, actually, it's very difficult to find out who does what in a Japanese
Oh
company. I
yeah.
found
Oh yeah.
very vagueness of job responsibilities is just actually part of life at a lot of these. And you're like looking at like a sheet that approves a project, and there's
Mm,
10 different people's Hanko name stamps at the bottom that approve it. So anytime you're like, who is responsible for this? Oh, 10
10
people.
people.
uh, that's part of it, is just those are the networks. There's like 10 people kind of involved with a project. You don't
Mm-hmm.
know who really does what part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I usually had, because of language limitation, my own, I had better success attaching myself to somebody who took a personal interest in what I was doing as a participant,
Mm-hmm.
and they were willing to give me their time to explain things that were all done in Japanese, tell me how to help out. So that's where I comfortably found a place navigating these networks you mentioned that are very complex.
How did you find them? How did you find those people? Was it kind of like a natural thing that you just guys naturally connected, or did you, kind of find someone and kind of seek them out, or how did that happen?
They happen for personal reasons usually.
Yeah.
A lot of Japanese, especially those with an interest in learning English,
Mm-hmm.
or just the more worldly people, uh, just gravitate into interest. You're pretty novel in these situations as a foreigner, to say the least, and so you'll get a lot of interest that way. And so that was my first company. One of the best friends I made in Japan was a middle manager who I happened to live near Camp Zama, which is that U.S. Army base in Kanagawa,
Oh, in
and
Kanagawa?
our office was out there, and he would always take English lessons at Camp Zama, and always enjoyed it, and he's just a middle manager at my company, wasn't a VP, but he was taking a lot of interest in helping me learn. He was an engineer and learned the technology of the company, took me on customer visits that he didn't have to, made sure I looked busy, because sometimes I felt I wasn't given anything important to do, and he saw that, and he loved drinking with me, and that helped. And so you take whatever you can get as an angle to connect with people in these environments, I think is a good piece of advice that helped me navigate. My hiring manager didn't mind that this guy took me under his wing, and so that helped too.
Right.
He just sort of was like, oh, I didn't really hire him to do that, but if he wants to do
Okay.
that, go ahead.
Yeah.
I'm like,
Right. This
okay,
is so much that getting back to exactly what you said, which is no one really knows what anyone does because everyone kind of does a little bit of everything as long as you like ask somebody. And this is something to really take away, that as if you're, a foreigner in Japan, and you're looking, to progress in your career, you're looking for mentorship. Our kind of, Western thinking is, okay, well, let me find someone with a career that's most suitable to me and most, in line with my, growth path or whatever it is. But if that person, for whatever reason, doesn't click with you or isn't necessarily, if you have language problems or cultural gaps or whatever, you're going to have to look left or right of this person to who else can I talk to? And I think the ambiguity of a Japanese organizational structure in this case works in your favor, because you can go and knock on people's doors and be like, do you have anything for
yeah,
me to do? Whereas in a Western
yeah,
company, they'd be like, what the hell are you doing
yeah,
this work for sales? What are you doing?
yeah. That is one of the beauties, that you can turn a negative into a positive out of a ambiguous job environment. It's ambiguous for everyone, not just for you.
Yeah.
So learn how
Yeah.
to,
Yeah. Japanese people don't know either. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So it's not language, that's for sure. It's just the way it is, and try to embrace that, and like, yeah, find an angle that works, and that starts with making a personal connection, in my opinion,
Mhm.
with somebody who can help you do that in a way that's uh, looks and smells right
Right.
within the
Now,
company.
speaking of making personal connections for someone, that's like a mutually beneficial collaboration. Tell us about the manga artist and this whole story, because this is actually the story behind the Salaryman book that people don't know, and this is almost even an equally, rivaled story to the book itself.
Yes, she's just one of the greatest things that happened to me being in Japan, was finding a partnership with this professional Japanese manga artist named Reina Saya. She used to work for one of the biggest manga publishers here, and is actually an English-speaking freelance artist now, has been for the last several years. And I just found her searching online for an artist to help me with illustrating my stories about salaryman life on the blog. I just envisioned everything as having a couple images or illustrations. It's just, I'm not a manga hobbyist, but I always appreciated the artistry of it and the
Mm-hmm.
culture behind it, and a couple salaryman manga I always enjoyed. And so she was open to working with me, and we started small. And I created a barter agreement with her. She's like, if you teach me English on Skype, and help me out with looking at these contracts I get sent sometimes, I'll do an illustration every month or two, or every couple weeks, for your blog. And so we did that for like a couple years.
Oh, wow.
Started small, and God knows I had time on my hands with some of these Tanshin Funin assignments, where I could teach her English and enjoy it. And we really, yeah, we developed a rapport.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing I learned about here was just how much talent Japan has, I think, like
Mm.
her, people who probably are underutilized.
Oh yeah.
she freed herself from an unhappy publishing company experience. Being in-house in one of those publishing companies could probably seem like being a slave, I would imagine, to, in her words, doing lots of like teenage boy manga stories gets
Awesome.
repetitive, you know,
Yeah.
and like the same art over and over again. So I think there's a huge talent pool, people like her, creative types in manga or other creative fields, graphic design. Japan has a great sense in that. I think that's what I found as a very positive story, um, for me in Japan, was developing that collaboration and realizing I had some eye for how to do storyboarding. And like, I'm not a
Mm.
manga, I'm not a draw, I can't even draw a stick figure, but I'm a writer. And I love the idea of sort of working with her and directing a little of the art and putting together storyboard designs, and realized I didn't have those passions until she'd helped me tap into it.
Mhm. Which is probably one of the things that you need when you're on like a tanshinfunin assignment and you're sitting there alone and you're doing writing alone and you're thinking, ugh, how do I,
Mhm.
muster the motivation to turn my horrible experience or my difficult experience or whatever it is into
Mhm.
entertainment for others, while I'm sitting here alone, eating ramen or
Yeah.
whatever it is. But I could imagine that having that kind of, um, like listening board or that kind of collaborative relationship could really probably also improve your experience as a writer as well.
Yes. It helped a lot to explain the jokes to a non-native English speaker, to flush them out. Like,
Mm.
okay, is this funny? Well, let me talk it out with Reina to make sure she understands it. And if it's
What was
universally
your hit
funny,
rate? What was your hit rate with the jokes?
well, like I would
Were you like
I
9
would
for
say, hey, Reina,
10? Were you
is
like
this
2 for
funny? Like
10?
that my son laughs because I'm you take baths, right, with your
Mm-hmm.
family, with your kids in Japan, whereas you might not do that in the US, especially over a certain age. And my son would start to note how hairy I am and be like, hey, kitanai, your hair is dirty, making the bath dirty. And I'm like, yeah, yet another thing I don't fit in, and I'm just sort of laughing about it. And I'm like, this would be a great picture for our story on
Mm-hmm.
cleanliness, in the book. Is just sort of a, the stereotypical hairy gaijin causing trouble in the bath, the family bath. And I was like, Reina, is this funny? And she's like, it's funny, but I'm having trouble drawing you in a way that doesn't, because you're supposed to be naked but not naked in this book, right? So she's like trying to come up with a cloud over, covering my sensitive areas and
Uh-huh.
struggling with that. She's like, are you sure you're not embarrassed by this? These kinds of discussions happened that were just hilarious and a lot of fun, to
Mm-hmm.
explain this is why it's funny. And she's like, I don't think I would have thought that was a Japanese book wouldn't have that kind of humor, she kind of told me. And I was like, well, yeah, I think it works for us.
It's so funny. One of the moments that I find in talking about other cultures is that you end up learning more about your own culture than really about the other culture, right? So was there anything like as you were writing with the manga and things that you were trying to explain to Reina, hey, this, and then she's just like, no, that's different. And you're recognizing, oh, this is actually probably more my learning experience than
Yeah.
for other people.
I think the reverse culture shock of being transferred back to San Jose, uh,
I
as a
don't
quote
doubt that
unquote
for a second. I
expat,
don't doubt that for a second. Uh-huh.
was shocked at, suddenly I'm like, I can't enjoy throwing my clothes into a dryer anymore and blasting them with American electricity for 45 minutes. I feel so wasteful. And I'm like, Japan's ruined it for me. Yeah, I'm joking. But I'm used to hanging my clothes out every morning, saving the environment and the energy savings and the banality of it. Just doing that and showing your neighbors that you're hanging it, and like it just was like nobody uses their, even they have a dryer in one of those combination washer dryer units in Japan. They
Mhm.
never use the dryer. It's like, why'd you buy it then? I confronted my American wasteful side.
Mhm.
That shocked me. It was like learning how much I'm used to wasting as a person. I think I learned a lot and improved as a result of it. But there's still some parts where I'm like nostalgic, where I'm just like, yeah, like I can't enjoy blasting my clothes in a dryer like I used to, or garbage, the whole
Oh my
idea of
God,
recycling.
the garbage and the shoes inside, you were walking in your own house. You thought, take the shoes off.
Some parts I've adopted and happily so. And
Mhm.
others I'm like, I don't think I'm happier for having to separate my plastics from my my burnable from my non-burnable garbage. I don't think I'm any happier as a result
Right,
of
because
that
the
one.
logic is isn't it all burnable? But anyway, this is a conversation for another day. But
Yeah.
that's what I really love is this lens between, okay, to have that, empathy for the Japanese culture, but also to use that moment of reflection for yourself. Like it's also learning, what about this culture? What does it mean for them? But thinking, what does it mean for me? And what's my stance on this? And what I would love to know in from you is, what are some other things that that we can do to bring our full selves to the table? Because at the end of the day, right, when you've been in Japan so long, you do end up being this kind of mix. So it's kind of this cherry picking mode of, okay, I like this is my Japanese side, like as you said. I'm not,
Yeah.
I don't like being wasteful, but my American side is that I want to go and say the things that I want to say. And how do you navigate that landscape, and what are maybe some takeaways that you can say for people that that they're in the same situation? They're sitting down with their boss and they're saying, I want to bring my full self to the table, I want to do more. Is there anything that we can tell them?
Yeah. My first company that I was here in Japan, uh, I felt unproductive. And because they gave me like a 1-year training. They're like, just sit there for a year and learn. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, I'm not going to do that. I want to do something productive.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, well, what can you do? You don't know anything about us. I'm like, gosh, they, that's really what they expect. Younger, I was in my early 30s, but I was still considered
A
younger.
baby.
They expect you to learn, sit there and learn. And so I said, here's what I want to do. And I oversold this and got myself into a lot of work, but it actually worked. I said, why don't you have these distributors in the US doing the job that your people here in your office that know the product better should be
Mm-hmm.
doing, which is contacting US companies that could buy your product. Maybe they don't have the language or the network to do it, but I have some network and I have the language. Why don't you just let me not cold call, but just over 1 month, I'm going to come in every morning from 6:30
Mm-hmm.
6:30 to 8:30, and I'll call 3 or 4 companies and some of your distributors during that time, because in the US that's prime time hours because of the time difference. And they loved that idea. They were like, okay. They're like, I remember one guy who was suspicious of me and like my fit there. He didn't have any part of my hiring. When I started doing that and showing some notes from my calls, he started going, oh, Mike's on output. He didn't speak English, but all he simply said was output. Mike's on output. That means I'm outputting something. Good.
Oh, as in, okay, I'm
Thumbs
like
up.
waiting, like as in, もっとやった方がいいか. Like you should do more, you should do less. Yeah, but he's like, oh, you're doing output. Good job, Mike-san.
It was like a monosyllable. He was a very stoic guy who didn't speak much English and was an engineer. And he was like, Mike's on output, like that. Yeah. And I was like, that's all I need. Like, it shows me it's working.
Mm-hmm.
I reached that guy in a way. God, it was hard to do that because it was like
Sure.
the time I'm like, oh boy, now I got to get into the office at 6:30 for a month.
Yeah.
But so I'd find little victories like that
Mm-hmm.
you can take and put in your win column that inspire confidence.
What I love about
Yeah.
that example, to inspire, yeah, because it's what it's about. It's about inspiring confidence in your management to position you for the next task, right? So, the Japanese don't often do this kind of big leap of faith thing. That's not really their disposition. But if you can show up, with a business case, which is what you did. So one thing that, with this example that immediately struck me as being successful was that, you didn't approach from like the cultural perspective. You were like, this is the business case. I speak English. I can go, and I have, I have an empathy for the clients. I also understand what we're selling, which means that I'm probably a good person to bridge the conversation regarding pre-sales and things like that. So I think
Yeah.
that example um, and the thing that also I found is that if it doesn't cost them money, time, resources, a hanko,
Yeah.
usually you can get a yes. If you just say, I'm going to come into the office from 6:30 until 8:30 every single day, and then that's it. Their only question would be, okay, do I have to give you some kind of approval so that, your ID card works in the elevator at 6:30? Because, we're a black company. Black companies in Japan mean like black labor, as in like you have
Yeah.
poor labor management, and people work, early in the morning and late at night, and, things like that. So, for me, it's if you can position a business case without it being too much or too difficult to say yes, you usually get the yes.
Yeah. And it got me out of a lot of meetings. I
Hey,
could say,
nice. Yeah, yeah, for sure.
sorry, remember that task I volunteered? Skip that meeting, and it gave me a little bit of like an arsenal to a card to play to avoid the dreaded death by meeting culture that
Yeah.
sometimes
It,
happened.
which I love. So if we start thinking about like, future looking, so if we say, okay, we've developed all these experiences, and, the time that we're in, like we've seen 10 years growth, especially in e-commerce and, online collaboration, and, in the IT industry in 3 months or even less. If we look to the kind of the future now, and you're looking at, okay, the salaryman, like for the future, what are some opportunities that you see for Japan, or for foreigners working in Japan?
Yeah, I wonder with the effect of COVID, what it'll have on some of these traditional companies like I worked for. I've actually started texting a few of them saying, "How are you guys doing during the COVID?" Hoping to get an interesting story or two.
Yeah.
And I, I don't think they've changed too much. They were all pretty much still going to the office every day, um, and
Yeah.
that raised my eyebrows. Thought if they can't change during this time, that's trouble.
Hmm.
Uh, but that was early on. I haven't checked since. So I'm curious if my theory is like I think Japan needs to like de-emphasize Tokyo and start to spread out a little bit into other
Interesting.
parts of
Hmm.
Japan. I
Hmm.
think Tokyo is overcrowded and overly bureaucratic as a result, and bloated sometimes in these corporate structures of their companies here.
Hmm.
So I do. This is I'm not an expert in socioeconomics of Japan, but I do sense that that's where Japan wants to go
Yeah. Well,
with a lot
imagine
of
the
its initiatives.
benefits. Imagine the benefits for those towns then receiving, those people that just say no. We're fed up with Tokyo. Like, you know, having friends that live in Zushi and kind of like down there, which is kind of like an hour and a half from Tokyo. It's on a
Yeah.
beach town, and if you have an internet connection, essentially, there are many jobs that are centralized in Tokyo that don't need to be.
Yes. So that's where my hope is for all salarymen in development or career women in development in the grade schools now in Japan is like when they come into the workforce, it'll be a lot more flattened as far as location, or a little more flattened, and choices of not having to like live in a corporate dormitory in outskirts of Tokyo to start your
Yeah.
career. And I think the like things like Furusato Noze, which is um, that whole government system of turning your city tax in Tokyo that you pay, converting that into a charitable donation for a rural area. That whole not revolution, but I guess it became just a huge hit.
It's a new
Um,
approach for sure. Yeah.
yeah, they know they need to spread the money and the wealth and the capital around the country.
Mhm.
And that was a huge loophole that probably did that too much. But the idea is that I think that's a good vehicle for change, is to actually loosen up on job locations so that you don't have overcrowding, over too much bureaucracy. You can get into a little more of like tax benefits,
Mhm.
and just ease the cost of living on young
Mhm.
families. I do.
Mhm.
That would be my vision for what I hope happens for traditional Japanese companies in the future.
And what about you? What's the next stories for you? What are the next stories that you're writing?
Mm-hmm. So I spun off the Salaryman book into a full manga with the same artist, and released that last month. So it's a new manga series.
Omedeto, congratulations.
Oh, thank you. So issue number 1 is available Amazon, and it it's based on the same concept of you know of the memoir, which is my experience working in Japanese companies and what I learned about U.S. and Japanese culture from it. So doing more issues of that every month, with Reina, my manga artist, is the plan. I need lots of customer support to make that happen, but it's been awesome, and the reaction's been great, and would love to get people's feedback on it.
Is there a different lens, like to the from the manga to the book, or are they essentially more or less, the same essence of the story, or is there a different kind of approach or a different like feeling behind one or the other?
Yeah, so writing a memoir, my memoir is basically like my theories on how I adjusted to Japan, theories and
Interesting.
observations, and the characters and the dialogue and the that stuff is more of the context.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the manga, it's the reverse. It's the
Right.
characters and the situations, and the
And then,
dialogue
right. And then you
that's at the
deduct
forefront.
the learning. Okay. And then you deduct the learning yourself. Interesting.
So that's the difference in the mediums, for me, is that
Mm-hmm.
manga's visual, it's dialogue driven, it's situation driven, and it brings out a lot more of the Japanese point of view than the memoir, which is entirely personal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the manga, I'm bringing in, Japanese thought bubbles and narration, and I have to guess what they might be thinking. That's part of just the fiction of it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's my my estimation of what the Japanese might be thinking, or what somebody told me they were thinking. But it's fictional though, compared to the memoir, which is nonfiction.
Mm-hmm. I love that, because so much of the work that we do in innovation is based on what is this person thinking? What is it that they really need, or what's going on kind of for them? And I think that even, for example, using manga and, as you mentioned, storyboarding and these kinds of, methodologies, and as much as it's a story, it's actually, maybe even a takeaway for people, that when you're speaking to someone and you're thinking, this person, we're not even just not on the same page, we're reading different books here, maybe just have a manga moment and just imagine speech bubbles above their head and think, obviously they're thinking something, right? It doesn't, like, it's not that they're thinking nothing, they're thinking something. It might be completely obscure to you, it might make no sense and be completely illogical, but they've got something in their mind. So take a step back and think, what are the speech bubbles of this person? And that might even help understand a little bit more the next time that you have a misunderstanding.
Yeah, think in terms of speech bubbles. That's a good way of applying manga to a real life. You don't have to be a writer or an artist. It's healthy to take notes and try to empathize with people. And if that helps you, here's my speech bubble. You're losing your attention during a meeting. Try to do a thought bubble on what the people around you are thinking. That
Mhm.
probably is healthy.
I love that. Thank you so much. And if we think about, we've been so lucky to have so much of your time, Mike. And if we were to kind of wrap it up with kind of on a positive note, because there's a reason that, Japan as a country, despite all the challenges, has one, talent like yourself. to stay, and you think, you know what, this is my home now, this is, where I'm going to build my life. Can we finish with maybe why Japan is still the place for you after all the ups and downs and all the challenges and all the headaches and Tanshin Funin that you've decided, yeah, no, Japan, I'm still going to stay here?
Uh, it always, even though the book describes ups and downs and lots of not many triumphs and a lot of defeats, but a lot of positive lessons that were fun as a consumer. So Japan remained my home for all this time because I found that way of how to be a consumer from all these great mentors or friends through the company. Taught me how to, Mike, here's how you enjoy this. Here's how you do furusato noze. Here's how you enjoy all the perks of living here the way I do. That balance, that's a balance it's a positive feedback loop for you that keeps you here, I think, because Japan has so much to offer on a personal level. Whether it's just, if you're interested just in the art or the food or the drinks or the clubs or the beaches, temples, how to enjoy that like a Japanese is part of why I stayed. Is like I wanted to learn how they enjoy those things that are their own, that are so impressive. So what do I have to learn from that? And every boss I went to bought into me as an idea to help his company improve in something. So I appreciated that too. That there was a spark of positivity that brought me there. So I did appreciate that, and it'll help me build a life here too.
Yeah. Mike, thank you so much. And one of the reasons that your story is so important to showcase is because, we want to create this kind of dialogue around what it's really like, doing business in Japan, and not just, what it was like in the 80s where kind of all of the material kind of stopped. We wanted to really modernize the dialogue. Again, there's no academic approach to this. It's simply just talking about our experiences, what you've gone through, and you as an individual, collaborating and being supported by other individuals. Obviously the process isn't necessarily, replicatable, but what we want to do is to create this kind of sense of hope and community that that it's a good place to be, and certainly that you can succeed no matter where you are, especially in Japan, with kind of the right support and especially the right community.
Yeah, I agree with that mindset. Definitely.
So on that note, thank you so much for joining us. You're super welcome to come back on the Business Karaoke podcast whenever you like, especially to introduce maybe even your next manga series.
Oh, I'd love to. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.